Welcome to the show. My name is Charlton with Big C. This is Charlton and Big C Sports. Coming to you worldwide on the Big C Sports Network, on the #1 network in the United States of America. And Big C Sports has been voted the #1 sports show in the universe, according to Big C and them good old boys down south. I want to say bienvenidos to all of our listeners in Latin America, also across the pond in London, England, as well as Paris, France. Of course, you good old boys in Canada. We love you in Africa, the Big C tribe. But there's no one we love more than the good old boys down south in the land of the free and the home of the brave. On a beautiful July the 2nd, 2020, Fondo Deportes, Big C is still doing his thing down south, recovering from the POTUS rally after Juneteenth, and then the rally in Tulsa, Oklahoma. They said, go back to your S-hole country, Big C. It's all fair, left the war. We'll be back at the saddle soon. I want to say today's show is sponsored by your Northern California Cadillac dealers, home of the all-new Cadillac Escalade, the standard of the world. And when you go by and test drive yours, tell them Charlton and Big C sent you, as well as a fleet of Cadillac cars. Also, anywhere in the world, just say Google or Alexa, play Big C Sports Podcast. You will hear from our sponsors. You will hear, welcome to the show. I will introduce Big C as the Mystic, and he'll do his thing from 3,000 miles away. And I really appreciate the way things are growing with Big C Sports. You can follow Big C Sports on Xfinity, Comcast TV, Apple TV, Roku TV, Amazon Fire TV, and a lot of smart TVs all over the universe. But you better have a smart TV, or you'll be looking at a still picture, just like the still picture that you saw down at the POTUS rally, Big C. What were there, like 20 people outside the arena, and you were shaking a couple of people's hands? They told you not to do that, especially down in the South, Big C. I want to say, as we all pause, coming up on this beautiful 4th of July holiday weekend, a lot of people are taking Friday off, but Big C and I want to make sure we never take off on the Veterans Crisis Hotline. They are experienced in helping veterans and their loved ones get help. We really want to make sure that we always give out that number for our veterans who need help. It's 800-273-8255. That's 800-273-8255. Or you can text 838-255. That's 838-255. If you're online, simply go to veteranscrisisline.net. That's veteranscrisisline.net, and you can get some help. I really love giving out that number. Also, very happy to be affiliated with Valley Homes Weekly TV on Dish TV, DirecTV, AT&T Uverse, TV 53, home of the San Francisco Giants, home of the Say Hey Kid. Just tell them Big C sent you. The goal is simple: recruit 100 real estate brokers, put their property listings on TV, just like McDonald's does it. Car dealerships do it. Sports teams are going to start doing it too after they come off the pause. Watch real estate work for you with television. The magic of TV really works. 800-772-8624. That's 800-772-8624. Also, for opportunities in real estate, go to bigcsports.pacwm.com. That's bigcsports.pacwm.com, and you can see opportunities in real estate and mortgages. We already have over 100 loan officers looking for more, and so I really love what that means. Coming up on this beautiful 4th of July weekend, so many things happening in the world of sports. We know COVID-19 is spiking. There's still more athletes testing positive. We know that Black Lives Matter. Really appreciate Pope Francis and his messages to Black Lives Matter. Donald Trump says it's a terrorist group. I guess swastikas and Confederate flags are not from hate groups, Big C, but it's all fair in love and war. I just want to go back to make sure that I pay homage to what happened with the ESPYs, because sometimes we see things one time and we don't go back and look at it again, so it's in one ear and out the other. It's like, have you ever tried to eat a potato chip, and if you open the bag, that's the mistake right there, Big C. When you open the bag, you can't just eat one. You gotta eat more than one. Or if you ever remember the streets of San Francisco, it was Telly Savalas. How many licks did it take to get to the center of that lollipop? He was always licking on that lollipop, Big C. It took a lot of licks to get to the center of Telly Savalas' lollipop. So you have to lick it more than one time. You ever have to lick something more than one time, Big C? If that makes sense to you. Like an envelope, you gotta lick it more than one time, Big C. Wash your hands more than one time, too. If that makes sense to you. But I want to make sure I pay homage to the ESPYs. Malcolm Jenkins did his thing, NFL football player. Also Lindsey Vonn, and then Steve Kerr, Russell Wilson, many other athletes. They share Big C's thoughts, and also Pope Francis' thoughts on equality. And you know, when you go and get prayer, how many times I've known people to go to church, and they go to church just to dip the wine. They want to dip the cracker into the wine, if that makes sense. Big C. And sometimes people say, "Do I only get one sip?" You know, unlike how many licks it takes to get to the Cinderella lollipop. When you go to church and they have you take communion, you can only have one sip of wine, Big C, and one piece of bread. It's all fair in love and war. But I know a lot of guys try to get away with trying to double dip. So, what a great country we live in. You can double dip, Big C. You can double dip with a lot of things in life. Really appreciate that. I know there's a lot going on in this world. Because it's so important to me. And I talked about earlier how it was I don't mind mentioning the other podcasters. We're all in the same industries. It's a small universe. But I want to pay homage to Joe Rogan, who's about to sign the $100 million contract with Spotify. And it was in the Washington Post on May 27th, 2020. And how he says, "Welcome to the Mother Blanken Show," Big C. How we do welcome to the show. He says, "Welcome to the Mother Blanken Show." And he also uses some profanity. You know, I'm learning, if you want to get to that level of $100 million, sometimes you got a copycat. And then last night I was listening to his podcast, and he said something about an app. He said, "It's the best cap in the Mother Blanken universe," Big C, if that makes sense to you. How many times did he say it? More than once. The Mother Blanken universe. I wonder where he got that from. So Don Ostroff with Spotify. You want the real McCoy, or do you want the copycat? It's all fair love and war, but you can Google what I'm saying. But congratulations, $100 million is nothing to frown on, especially when people say, "How's he make $100 million for profanity?" Sometimes I want to know too. That's why I'm using more. I don't use the whole profanity. My profanity, Big C, is like Francis Scott Key version of the national anthem that was redacted. Some of the bad words were redacted. So I redact the bad words when I say the Mother Blanken universe. That's like Francis Scott Key. And people want to make sure that they say the national anthem, but they don't say the whole thing. I was reading some things and watching some more information I'll talk about later in today's program. Of the top 50 programs for 2019, 41 were football, Big C. And that's where a lot of people get to watch their favorite athletes get out and play. But I want to talk more about HR 40 and reparations for African Americans. There's this thing called Black Lives Matter that's going around the world, and we've also dealt with the Me Too movement. Have you noticed the Me Too movement has taken a back seat? So I guess that means that no more women are dealing with sexual assault, right? No one's talking about it. Even women on TV are not talking about sexual assault. So I know there are things that have gone on in this country, and I've always felt that we as men can advocate for women just like we're asking people to advocate for Black Lives Matter. They don't have to be African American. It's important to me. That's why I love talking about it. When you think about sexual assault that happened on the plantations, it did not have the Me Too movement, Big C. Those are black women. And nowadays, sports all over the universe is on pause because a lot of our athletes are not playing. From college football, the Power 5 programs, they're about 75 to 80% African American athletes. NBA basketball is about 80% African American athletes. NFL football is about 75% African American athletes. And when you look at football, for NFL and college, they're the most watched programs in television. And they're run by African American athletes. But there's something I wanted to bring up because Me Too movement is real. But it happened to black women from 1619 to 1865, and really 1965 when the Civil Rights Law was finally signed into law. But there was in 1868, Elizabeth Keckley published Behind the Scenes, kind of like the Me Too movement, or 30 Years a Slave, and 4 years in the White House. You know, where POTUS says that Black Lives Matter is a terrorist group, POTUS. But going back to 1868, it really was a lot of terrorism going on in the White House. Elizabeth Keckley published Behind the Scenes, or 30 Years a Slave in 4 Years in the White House. The memoir detailed the 50-year-old Keckley's 3 decades as a slave woman. Enslaved person, I should say enslaved person. Angela Rye said her father, she was on the CNN last night. I really appreciate Angela Rye. And I realized that Common may have needed some glasses when you watch Angela Rye. Like, what's wrong with that, brother? You see, it's all fair. How many licks does it take to get to the center of a lollipop? It's all fair and love and war, but Common needs some glasses. But it's all fair. Angela Rye said that her father talked about, when we say slaves, it's such a derogatory term and word. It was really enslaved people. The same way if you were to capture a white girl right now and enslave her, they wouldn't call her a slave, they'd call her a captured woman. People know that. So I want to even correct myself when it comes to that. But 50-year-old Keckley's 3 decades as an enslaved person, and how she secured freedom for herself and her son, and her friendship with the Lincolns during the Civil War. Also within the pages of her book was Keckley's public revelation that she had been routinely raped by a white man, and that she was a young woman. And although revealing the abuse, she chose to spare his name, because we know that oftentimes when black women came forward and said that anything happened to them, they were tortured or murdered. And that's a fact. So the original Me Too movement, it was not televised. It was not publicized. It was not something where law enforcement came to your aid and locked up people like Weinstein, or Matt Lauer hasn't been locked up. But we know what's happened with Epstein and POTUS with all of his sexual assault allegations that are going on. There's a lot of men. That guy, Bill O'Reilly at Fox News, he was sexually assaulting women at such a tune that Fox News gave him $32 million to walk away. Isn't that something? He didn't go to jail. So privately coming forward as a survivor of any sexual or physical abuse is hard enough. To publicly name the abuser often led to a negative result for the African American women, the enslaved women. Legal prosecution of the offender was not certain. Economic and or physical retaliation was a great possibility, oftentimes a grave possibility. And then the public scrutiny, if not shame, for a certain amount of the women who went through that, they were victims nonetheless. And if they came forward, oftentimes they were injured and harmed, and even the people that they loved. So the resistance oftentimes was futile because they led to a lot more damage, if that makes any sense to you. So with the Me Too movement, and most of the white women that gave Oprah Winfrey a rousing ovation, resounding standing ovation in Hollywood, the original Me Too movement were women who looked like Oprah. They looked like Halle Berry. They looked like Michelle Obama. They looked like Condoleezza Rice. They looked like Naomi Campbell. They were beautiful African American women. And they were taken advantage of with impunity. So when you think about the Me Too movement, I know people want to hear sports, but most of those black athletes, they came from either a mother or a grandmother that was also African American. And often too many times we don't think about the Me Too movement, how it affected them. Imagine when you go, if you have the chance to read that book by Elizabeth Keckley, published Behind the Scenes, and then you had Erin Andrews that got $55 million. I don't know if they gave her that. They may have settled it. But for a white man staring at her while she was naked, $55 million. And she covers sports athletes that are half naked in the locker room. But she got $55 million because she was so distraught, in her words, that she couldn't function. So people understand that the Me Too movement had so many people calling in and saying it happened to me too. That's why hashtag Me Too came up, and a lot of people run behind that scene, and there's nothing wrong with supporting that. But I just wanted to make sure, as we want to get back into sports and see people score touchdowns and hit home runs and dunk a basketball and shut up and dribble, as Laura Ingraham said, there are so many women of color that it happened to, and they were not treated like Erin Andrews. They were not allowed to get $55 million for being raped. Erin Andrews got it just by being looked at and, I guess, partially clothed. Isn't that something? from 1619 to 1865, where slavery was legal, and then up to 1965, where we had the Civil Rights passed, a lot of women of color and men, of course, too, had no recourse. And why is that important? Because the things we cannot name, as Chestnut explains, the delusion needed to ignore sexual misconduct is why someone today can say, grab him by the P-U-S-S, blah, blah, blah. And people laugh. They laugh. Oh, he's funny. That's just locker room talk, BC. Remember the locker room talk as women are still being assaulted? But the Me Too movement, it wasn't just recent. It's been going on since the Middle Passage, Big C. And I wanted to just pay homage opening today's show to African-American women, as many people will say, well, those women need to work harder, or those women, whatever they say about it. And when we talk about reparations with H.R. 40 that I want to bring up, the biggest reparation happened for white men in the United States of America, as people want to get rid of affirmative action. The free labor that built this country from 1619 really until now, if you include the criminal justice system, there are fast food companies that have prison labor that are making hamburger meat for 20 cents an hour. You don't think that's part of the new Jim Crow? They don't pay them a living wage? 20 cents an hour for pressing hamburger meat that a lot of people eat at fast food restaurants? We know disproportionately men of color have been targeted for the criminal justice system. But I want to finish this before I get into sports, because it all ties in. The Me Too movement started with black women, and now sports is on pause because a lot of the kids who came out of the womb of a black man or a black woman that make up the NBA and NFL football and college football, a lot of those men, they're begging, just like the people who were enslaved were begging for help, but they can only beg God, because if they spoke out too loud, they would be murdered. And people are beaten or whipped more. But she mentions that her father was a white man, and he was admitted to be such a mean person, and he had no worries about anyone doing anything to him to correct his behavior, not even his wife. So you hear it growing up, as people can't wait for sports to start, oftentimes they ignore the pain that black women went through as they were being brutalized by the white, I don't even want to say owners, but that's what they were. They were considered owners of property. And most of the times those women had no recourse. And people can't wait now in 2000 for those kids that come from that lineage to get out and play sports so I can make some money off of you guys. Even we have a deadly pandemic, we still need to get out and play. So I wanted to touch on that because that's so important. The real Me Too movement, it was not in Hollywood that happened with Caucasian women saying that they were sexually assaulted, or somebody touched them in the wrong spot, or someone did what POTUS says, grab them by the P-U-S-S, blah, 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 blah. The real Me Too movement was centuries of rape against women of color, and they had no recourse. Not even God did anything about it, as people learn to pray all the time. But I wanted to make sure that I paid homage to black women. It's something that I want to bring up to today's date. Jonathan Irons is free after 22 years in prison. Maya Moore, WNBA star, put a career on hold to help him overturn his 1998 conviction, and he was serving 50 years for burglary and assault before the judge overturned his conviction this week. He was innocent. You know who convicted him? An all-white jury. The Me Too movement. There's a lot of things that people have overcome. And oftentimes, when POTUS says that Black Lives Matter is a terrorist group, imagine the terrorism that black women went through as they were being raped for over 3 centuries by people who look just like POTUS with the same attitude, with impunity. And he can't even say that Black Lives Matter. So with Maya Moore, she did a lot of things that were great. And as Jonathan Irons walked out of the Jefferson City Correctional Center, it was Wednesday, Maya Moore felt overwhelmed. For Irons, 40 years old, very young man. These were his first steps outside of the Missouri State Maximum Security Prison in 23 years. I know you want to hurry up and shut up and dribble. I know you want to see guys run up and down the court. I know you want to see people dunk a basketball. I know you want to see them hit a home run. You can't wait to see them score a touchdown. Touchdown! Home run! A three-point play! I know you want to hear that stuff. But I wanted to pay homage to black women because I opened the show intentionally, as Big C said, how many licks does it take to get to the center of a lollipop? Takes a lot. But for a man to spend so many years in prison, 23 years, and it took a black woman that meets the profile of women who had been sexually assaulted for 3 decades in this country with impunity. And it took her to walk away from a career and WNBA career where she's considered one of the best players in the NBA universe, and she walked away to help another man. And Moore's 31 years old. This was a moment that she waited for years to materialize once she sacrificed her WNBA career for. And as a true embrace, Moore had a question for the man she had known since she was 18. How does it feel? How does it feel? Opening the show, talking about women of color who were held as they were enslaved, raped for centuries, Big C, with impunity by white men. And here was an all-white jury 23 years ago that sentenced a black man to prison for a crime that he did not commit. That means he was innocent, for you people who carry the Confederate flag. So I just wanted to make sure that I acknowledge, from being victimized to being a hero, oftentimes women of color have been pushed aside, brushed aside, and not really given the same amount of credit like a Harriet Tubman for being an abolitionist. We're not given the same amount of credit that we need to give to especially African American women. That's why God created Big C Sports. I want to touch on one more thing before I get in to some things that are happening in the sports world. So every time you watch an African American athlete run up and down the football field, slam dunk a basketball, hit a home run, track and field, whatever it is, Black Lives Matter, NASCAR, and trying to get rid of the Confederate flag. It took a black man to bring down the Confederate flag that POTUS is trying to make safe in our government. And so as people are watching about Black Lives Matter and what does it mean, they just want to see people play sports. I want to also pay homage to another African American woman. Her name is United States Representative Sheila Jackson Lee. She has the proposed Marshall Plan. It's called H.R. 40. People keep saying, well, what does Black Lives Matter? Let's go around a school and take down a building that was named after a Confederate soldier. Well, that may be nice to do. People are going to clap. But why everyone should know what H.R. 40 is? The Commission to Study and Develop Reparations Proposals for African Americans Act. This bill establishes the Commission to Study and Develop Reparations Proposals for African Americans. I started the show telling you how for centuries black women were raped by white men. Helped build this country. Raised their children, plowed the fields, did everything. Built buildings for nothing. They didn't get compensated. So this bill by a black woman, Congressional Black Congress, the caucus, the commission shall examine slavery and discrimination in the colonies and the United States from 1619 to the present and recommend appropriate remedies. Among other requirements, the commission shall identify the role of federal and state governments in supporting the institution of slavery. Forms of discrimination in the public, people got to keep that in mind. Forms of discrimination in the public and private sectors against freed slaves and their descendants, and lingering negative effects of slavery on living African American society. As people say, oh, we could never look at reparations, I just told you Aaron Andrews, a Caucasian sports reporter that makes a living covering black men, where a white man looked at her in a hotel through some type of spying mechanism, and she filed charges on the hotel, and a white jury, like the same makeup of the jury that put Mr. Irons away for being innocent, spent 23 years in prison for being innocent. Well, another all-white jury gave Erin Andrews $55 million for being looked at partially naked. And then people say, we don't want to talk about reparations. We don't want to talk about people who were murdered for years and who did free labors for 3 centuries, 3.5, almost 4 centuries. We don't want to talk about that. The biggest reparations ever given to the United States of America was over 3 centuries of slavery. Uncompensated. And so don't tell me, well, the Civil War should have made it atone for it. No. The Civil War happened, and Erin Andrews still got awarded $55 million for another white man looking at her naked. And I wanted to make sure that we pay homage to black women, because for the black families, for the most part, after Jim Crow, and oftentimes people couldn't get work, the government only gave black women some assistance if the man was out of the home. So a lot of men chose to leave the home so their children would not starve. And then they label black women as, oh, they don't work as hard, or they just want to have babies and get on the system. No, white men have been on the system for almost 4 decades. It was the rape of black women with impunity, and the free land, and the mutilation of black men, and all the free labor that built up and money has been bequeathed from generation to generation. And I know you want us to shut up and dribble and play ball, but people have to know that, because H.R. 40 is going to pass. It's going to pass with the next administration. And if it doesn't pass in the next administration, remember that when they ask for your vote. Erin Andrews can get $55 million for being naked. You tell me you can build up Western Europe and Germany with the Marshall Plan? That was over $15 billion, which would be about $90 billion money. That's not United States citizens. So Mr. Irons goes free after being incarcerated, which he was innocent. So I want people to just keep that in mind as we look at finding more ways to help people form a more perfect union. Big C, in the last 24 hours, Major League Soccer players, 10 have tested positive for COVID-19. I was talking about FC Dallas yesterday. Isn't that amazing? On yesterday's show, there were only 6 that had tested positive. There's been 4 more in the last 24 hours. And so I just hope that we can put our feet and our hands together and walk our mail-in ballots and do whatever people can do to make sure that we get people out there and vote, because that's so important. We can't sit back and hope that things are going to change on their own. It's going to take all of us collectively to change things on their own, and we're going to go. Think about this. I just opened up the show talking about for centuries, over 3.5 centuries, nearly 4 centuries, how people of color, specifically African American women, were raped, tortured by white men, the people who owned property. They were not given rights at that time. So at the same time, I want people to understand that it's important. We can sing about what it takes to make things better, and we can clap, and we can say, let's go down and play sports. But people got to vote. We got to make sure that we vote. And I opened up the show talking about Mr. Irons, through the help of Maya Moore, being released from prison, from incarceration. I talked about in the White House, a lady who had been raped by the owner, if that makes any sense to you, for years with impunity. And now we're telling young men, go down and play in COVID-19 infested Florida so we can get, entertained? I think it's just incredible. NBA basketball, Big C. 9 more players test positive for COVID-19. 9 more test positive for COVID-19. That's announced today. The 9 positive tests have been between June 24th and June 29th, bring the overall total to 25 players out of a pool of 351 who've been tested since June 23rd. 16 players tested positive last week. The NBA also said that 10 of the 884 team staff members who were tested also tested positive for COVID-19. Anyone tested positive for COVID-19, they will remain in self-isolation until they satisfy public health and safety protocols and are cleared by a physician. You know, for the guys who tested positive in the bubble, they were already cleared by physicians in public health. They tested positive anyway for COVID-19. We're going to take the Big C timeout, also known as the Big C pause. We'll come back in just a moment. We are back from the Big C timeout, also known as the Big C pause. You can follow Big C Sports 24 hours a day, 7 days a week on the number one podcast network in the universe. I almost sneezed. If you heard the pause, I wasn't trying to do the pause, Big C. I almost sneezed. You ever have a sneeze? When you get one, you always usually get a second sneeze out of it. So that was and I guess the universe wanted to have another Big C pause. It's all fair love and war. But the NBA season is scheduled to resume July 30th with 22 teams participating in Orlando, Florida. Training camps will run from July 9th through the 29th with 3 scrimmages per team. It's all fair in love and war. They want to make sure they get those boys out there. And maybe Laura Ingraham, as much as I criticize Laura Ingraham for her enmity toward intelligent black men, except for Dinesh D'Souza, but he was convicted of campaign finance reform. So she likes those rogue brothers, Big C, if that makes sense to you. She likes them rogue, different shade, if that makes sense to you. But all fair in love and war. The NBA is going to get players out there playing, doing their best to overcome. And I believe that the attitude now is they're just going to have people play. Whoever tests positive, they'll treat them for whatever they got to treat them for and focus on how to keep people safer. But being safe, I think it's collateral damage, and we don't know the long-term ramifications. But they are still, according to now, they are on schedule to go into Orlando, Florida, and do their thing. The NBA is also in deep discussion on a second bubble and what's known as the second city. Chicago's known as the second city. But for the 8 teams that were not invited to play in Florida with COVID-19, enabling them to participate in a mini training camp in subsequent games against the other clubs. With the target date of September, sources are telling many sports outlets. And so people, I guess, I don't know how bad COVID-19 is in the Chicago area, but I know they're looking at teams that can get down there, are up there to Chicago and play. The Atlanta Hawks, Charlotte Hornets, Chicago Bulls, Cleveland Cavaliers, Detroit Pistons, Golden State Warriors, Minnesota Timberwolves, and the New York Knicks were the 8 teams not invited to Orlando for the league's restart date. And ironically, they may be happy that they don't have to go down there and be in that bubble where a lot of people have been testing positive anyway. So Pistons coach Dwayne Casey said he took an informal poll among the coaches who are not in Orlando, and he said the majority of them prefer holding their own mini camps. We know they're going to figure out how to get some action going because there's a lot of money on the line. And as I said in yesterday's program, if you want to get the white Americans vote, pejoratively, not everyone, but as a monolithic group, it's the fear of death or the loss of money. They've done more the fear of death ending wars, and because of loss of money, they've done a lot. The Arizona passed the Martin Luther King holiday. It failed twice, but the NFL told them, you're not going to get a Super Bowl and watch our boys run up and down the field unless you vote for Dr. King. How do you not vote for a Dr. King holiday? Just like how do you not vote for a Juneteenth holiday? I guess sometimes people don't have it in their blood, if that makes sense. They want to make sure that they do whatever they can to help themselves stay productive and relevant in their own communities where people may take a liking to them. But I think there's a lot of good things coming in the world of sports. And because of sports, I said sports will bring our society together, just like the NASCAR is racing cars up and down the road. NASCAR is doing a lot, even with COVID-19. I do want to just mention with NASCAR, because I really appreciate what they've been trying to do, and everybody has their own thoughts about it. But NASCAR, you know how we talk about Pope Francis and prayer? And I believe in prayer. It changes things. NASCAR is asking for help from the ministry, as well as Pope Francis, in pushing for social justice reform and, yes, Black Lives Matter. I just opened up talking about what happened at the White House in the 1800s. And there was an African-American woman who was enslaved, and she was raped repeatedly by the white man that she was owned by at that time with impunity. For you good old boys that like the Confederate flag, that means without punishment. So NASCAR meets with ministers pushing for racial equality. As Donald Trump says, Black Lives Matter is a terrorist group. POTUS says that. A lot of pastors don't agree with him. It was Reverend Greg Dumright. He watched members of his ministry crowd the fence at Talladega Speedway or Super Speedway to cheer for African-American driver Bubba Wallace. He realized his first NASCAR race was the start of his immersion into the stock car racing. But it was less than 3 weeks later that Drumright had a seat at NASCAR's leadership table, and he said he's ready to disrupt the industry's social hierarchy and get more people of color involved, from the boardroom to the grandstands as well as the track. It's going to take good people of all, but to me, for anyone that says that Black Lives Matter, they're tired of hearing about it as a terrorist group or whatever garbage, when you have pastors and the Pope and bishops from all over the country putting it to prayer, taking it to God, even though God turned his back for about 4 centuries, as black women were saying, please stop raping me, Black Lives Matter, God didn't show up to help them. It took the law. It took people marching. It took law to change it. It took the Civil War. It took a lot of things. But even the Civil War didn't end it. It still had Jim Crow for 100 years after the Civil War. But they want to see a call for diversification and true equity in the sports as it expands. And they know that in order for people to really realize that we all deserve this equality push that we're all pushing for, it's going to take good people. And even when you have the clergy behind it, to me that makes a lot of sense. When the clergy gets behind things, whether it's Pope Francis or any other bishop or pastor, people tend to pay more attention. At least that's what it feels like to me. And when you think about NASCAR banning the Confederate flag, where POTUS is trying to make it a hate crime to desecrate the Confederate flag, isn't that something? Or any statues. So who you're on the side of, the church or POTUS? But it stands to partnering with the minority community, specifically in the millennial minority community. These are the organizers and the demonstrators. These are the the colleges are getting a lot of people that are out there, even though schools are closed. But when people get back on college campuses, they can do a lot in pushing the student body and the administrators and the politicians on a local and a state and a federal level. And NASCAR, on the outside looking in, they're trying to create change. And I appreciate NASCAR. They want to see NASCAR that is true to the message of saying that liberty and justice for all, that NASCAR understands what it means to be African American, and that black lives do matter, just like all lives are affected by whatever crime goes on. But for the people that say, I'm tired of Black Lives Matter, all lives matter, I just told you, for 4 centuries, black women were raped with impunity. Did Black Lives Matter then? Not to white people. Did white lives matter then? Yes, especially for white men. So when people say, well, all lives matter, they've always mattered to white people. Since colonialism and imperialism, they've always mattered. And we're just asking for people to pay attention. Like the story that I gave on the enslaved person, even at the White House, when Lincoln was doing his thing, there were still women going through a lot of issues, being raped. Okay, you can read about it. That's why I gave you the story. So Drumright is a senior minister at the Citadel of Praise Church and Campus Ministries in Greensboro, North Carolina. Met with 2 NASCAR officials for what he hoped was a serious discussion about the industry's push for racial diversity. Unlike the White House, it's not diverse at all in the White House. If you consider Ben Carson the head of HUD, Housing and Urban Development, and POTUS has the biggest racial discrimination, housing discrimination against him in New York State. He's not going to get any pushback from Mr. Carson. He said that he was denied a chance to talk with NASCAR President Steve Phelps about the issues that mattered most to the group, but they're making an effort. NASCAR's making an effort. They're making more of an effort than the White House is, and I really appreciate that, because racism, according to Pope Francis, is a sin. And I appreciate that athletes can bring that message together. Would you believe? NCAA. I told you sports brings people together. In Idaho, they march and they bring athletes and police officers together. Isn't that something? This is following what happened with George Floyd's death. But they're planning a march at home in Pocatello, Idaho. And they wanted to reach out to law enforcement and students, athletes. A protest would not send the right message, so they decided, not in Pocatello, Idaho, where the police and the Idaho State athletes have a deep-rooted connection. If they were going to march, law enforcement had to be a part of it. Isn't that something? Law enforcement standing with Black Lives Matter? Idaho's mostly white. Potato capital. Boise State, Idaho State, University of Idaho. But a lot of people are trying to do whatever they can to bring people together. And I appreciate that, especially when you have law enforcement. If we could get the good law enforcement to weed out the bad law enforcement, then it would be better for everybody. Or to just treat black citizens the way you treat white citizens. That would make a big, to me, it would be a big thing for all of us if we want freedom and equality. It just matters. So I really am pleased when law enforcement decides to hold hands with black Americans, and don't buy that message that POTUS when he says when you arrest them, rough them up. Don't be so kind to them. The law enforcement, what he said, wartime president? He had 5 deferments. What's he talking about, wartime president? But I appreciate any law enforcement that says we want to be empathic. We want to stand with you and show you that we also want to weed out any negative behavior from law enforcement. You're sworn to protect and serve the public. And I really appreciate when you have the decent law enforcement officers doing the right thing. And not everybody's going to always do the right thing, even in the face of being ridiculed by President Trump. I don't want to call him the commander-in-chief, because the commander-in-chief won't even say anything to Vladimir Putin for putting a bounty on United States soldiers. Says nothing. Cat got his tongue. Isn't that something? NFL football camps will have fewer players in order to lessen the spread of COVID-19. But will it work? Remember, Big C, I said, how many licks does it take to get to the center of a lollipop? How many athletes does it take to get COVID-19 before the NFL says, maybe we should just put this whole thing on pause? But in an effort to combat the spread of COVID-19, NFL teams are likely to bring fewer than the regular 90 players that they ordinarily have to come to training camp whenever it begins, per a league source. And there are some people saying maybe they'll have an 80-man rosters. Others saying there's a talk about having 75 players potentially instead of 90. The NFL is also considering expanding its practice squad to 16 to 20 players in the event of a COVID-19 outbreak. If there is one, teams would have a deeper stash of players to activate to play games. Again, opening the show, talking about the Me Too movement and how African American women were the first Me Too movement. For almost 4 centuries, being raped with impunity. They were enslaved people by white men that, even if they didn't own them, you could sell them off, or your friends could come by and do whatever they wanted to do. And black women have been the pillar of our society. Dr. Leakey and Gregory Mendel, they opine that all life came from the African continent, from the womb of a black woman. Google Dr. Louis S.B. Leakey and Gregory Mendel. All life came from Africa. And so I love standing up for black women from every single person that's ever dealt with any inequality, anything that was unjust. Black women were oftentimes last hired, first fired, lowest paid, and even had to work as nannies for many of the slaveholders and their children. And for the slave owners that were married to white women, they were going into wherever they had their slaves and raping them anyway, while their white wives were in the house. And when the Me Too movement came out just recently, no one even acknowledged that it's been going on for centuries. They acted like it's only happened since white women were into the workforce. And to me, that's erroneous. Even Oprah Winfrey could check herself on that, because you stood up in front of Hollywood and you did so many great things. But to let Hollywood, which was mostly white women, were in the Me Too movement. That's why the courts came together against it. They turned their back on white women when black women were being raped, harmed, murdered. But when it happened to white ladies, then the law got involved, and it was Me Too, the Me Too movement. You saw commercials about it. Hollywood made TV commercials, and everyone wanted to get together and say, yeah, it happened to me too. But they only stopped at the workforce when white women were allowed to go into the workforce after black women marched in civil rights. The women's movement had nothing to do with being beaten over the head by billy clubs and sprayed with water hose and attacked with vicious dogs, but black women went through that. Now we're watching for athletes to come back and give more entertainment to people, and I always want to pay homage to the real Me Too movement. That happened to black women. But no one came to the rescue, Big C. No one came to the rescue. They told them, suck it up and just pray, and God's going to bless you. Just pray. The same God that let it happen is going to bless you. And that's why it's so important. I love talking sports and politics. A lot of people say, well, man, can you just stick to the score? No. I'm not. How many licks does it take to get the center of a lollipop? How many times will we have to say Black Lives Matter? We said Me Too movement for, a couple years? And now we have more women getting opportunities in the workforce and in Hollywood. For 4 centuries, black women have been crying out Me Too, and the court turned a blind eye. Said, so? Me Too what? That's why I think it's important. And I appreciate Pope Francis. Pope Francis sent a strong message to the U.S. Catholics after George Floyd's death. How many licks does it take to get to the center of a lollipop, Big C? Well, Pope Francis called the name twice and offered support to the American bishops who knelt in prayer during the Black Lives Matter protest. They didn't just kneel one time, Big C. That's why I appreciate Pope Francis. It's important because the Vatican's reaction suggests from the Pope on down is seeking to encourage anti-racism. And the protesters, while making a clear statement about where American Catholics stand ahead of President Donald Trump's bid for a second term in November. Remember, George de Blasio, mayor of New York, had Black Lives Matter painted on the streets, I think 5th Avenue, New York City, and Pope frowned upon it. He didn't want to hear that. He didn't want to see that. But Pope Francis is standing behind that. I think it's a matter of the heart. I've always believed that. I grew up with good and bad people in my environment, black and white, and I appreciate it when good people will not capitulate to negative behavior. It's so important. The Vatican has long spoken out about the racial injustice, and the popes dating back to Paul VI have voiced support for the civil rights movement and Martin Luther King Jr. His message of nonviolent protest. The histories of popes from the global south is no different. He quoted Dr. King at length during his historic speech to the U.S. Congress in 2015 and met with Dr. King's daughter as his predecessor had done. I've always said that violence created change for a lot of things. Of course, we all want nonviolence, but America was taken by violence, and I don't want to see more violence, but that's what America's always responded to. I believe violence when you go to the court and you vote. That's where you show your violence. Go to the court and you vote. And in all the pushes that people have on trying to create equality, we got to make sure that we keep talking about it. How many licks does it take to get to the center of the lollipop, Big C? A lot more than one. How many times does it take to talk about Black Lives Matter until we get HR 40 passed? More than one. That's why Big C Sports platform has been copied by everyone all over the world. And I really appreciate that because it just shows that we're doing things in the right direction. I also want to take the time, Herman Cain, former Republican presidential candidate, tested positive for COVID-19. And he's got pretty bad shape. He had to go to a hospital in Atlanta. And Herman Cain, he ran a 2012 Republican presidential candidate who attended President Trump's rally in Tulsa, just like you, Big C. You guys might want to stay away from the Trump rallies if that makes sense to you. You know what he says? What was his son? His son said that protesters were animals. He said protesters are animals. So if most of the people that attended the protest rally were white, he's calling the white constituents animals. But some people don't see it that way. And that's what we have in the White House. Crazy. The Herman Cain, 74 years old, tested positive for COVID-19. He developed symptoms serious enough to require hospitalization, according to a statement on his Twitter account. And the former Godfather's Pizza CEO is resting comfortably in an Atlanta area hospital after spending the night there. Statement said Mr. Cain did not require a respirator, and he's awake and alert. So I really wish him the best. I know that people got to make sure they stay healthy, and I don't know if Mr. Cain had a mask on when he went to the protest rally, as protesters were telling people not to. Even in the state of Texas, the governor's saying you got to wear a mask now. Isn't that something? In the state of Texas. You got to wear a mask. NCAA college football, some Texas Longhorns and football players, and I'm sure it's going to spread to further than just Texas, But Austin, Texas, which is very much one of the hardest hit areas of COVID-19, there's a linebacker by the name of DeMarvion Overshown. He said today that he will sit out from all team activities until the school starts meeting demands for campus changes sought by dozens of Longhorn athletes, football players. The demand made in early June included renaming several campus buildings currently named after former Texas officials with ties to the Confederacy and segregation, and it calls to drop the school song, The Eyes of Texas. Now, everybody has their own thoughts about how many things do we change, but I would just encourage those young men. U.S. Representative Sheila Jackson Lee, she has a 1,300-page proposal for the Marshall Plan. It's called H.R. 40 for African Americans. That would do more to eradicate some of the hate when it comes to money and lending and access to money and schools and funding. That would do more than changing the name on a building. But if you can do that, that's fine too. But I want to make sure that as college athletes, they join campus as campus activists to fight injustice. I remember that happened when I was in school. It was called the Pan-African Student Studies, and they were always focused on equality for everybody. But a lot of us have to get out and vote. If you have to have access to the financial system, the educational system, and changing the name on the building doesn't do that. We need H.R. 40 to pass. How many licks does it take to get to the center of a lollipop, Big C? How many licks will it take to pass H.R. 40? Google it. Changing names is one thing. Get H.R. 40 passed. Get your schools around that. If the Longhorn football program wants to do a sit down until they change the name of a building, they can change the name of a building. That doesn't make it easier for black Americans to get a loan when you want to buy a home or open a business or get college education or get into school or move into a certain neighborhood. Changing names is a step, but it's a small step. It's a small step, and we need, what do they say, one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. How many licks will it take to get the center of the lollipop, Big C? We can all do better, but we got to acknowledge it. I love the sports world, and I love the fact that young men on the campuses are doing whatever they can to try to make liberty and justice for all more of a reality. It happened when I was in college, and people change. You got to keep licking that lollipop, Big C. You got to keep licking on that lollipop, Big C, and things change. We just got to keep licking that lollipop to make things change. For people that say sports and politics don't mix, a lot of the dumb people say that. They used to say it anyway, even though everybody has that platform. NFL football games were 41 of the top 50 TV programs in 2019. You know what was second, Big C? Licking the lollipop. I mean, not licking the lollipop. You can tell I'm licking a lollipop coming up after the show. It was sports and politics, Big C. NFL continued to dominate American television in 2019. Of the 50 most watched television broadcasts of the year, 41 of them were NFL games. Isn't that something? Topped by the Super Bowl, but also the run-of-the-mill regular season games that top many entertainment programming and networks on the air. Football, Big C, the 9 programs among the top 50 that were not NFL games were the State of the Union, the President's Border Address, the Academy Awards, College Football National Championship Game, one College Football Playoff Game, Game 7 of the World Series, an episode of The World's Best that CBS aired immediately following the Super Bowl, and the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade, and the Grammy Awards. You know how we talk about the Me Too movement in Hollywood? Everybody's taking a stance for liberty and justice for all. You can follow Big C Sports 24 hours a day, 7 days a week on the #1 podcast network in the universe, iHeartRadio Podcast. You can follow Big C Sports on Apple Podcast. You can follow Big C Sports on Google Podcast. You can follow Big C Sports on many apps all over the world. Just say Google or Alexa, play Big C Sports Podcast, and you'll hear from our sponsors. And I really appreciate the way things are going with Big C Sports. But NFL is king, college football is king, and I just love the fact that we are talking about opening the show, how we focused on black women who were assaulted for 4 centuries, Big C, with impunity at the hands of white men. I know abolitionists happen to be white as well, but they didn't come to the aid of black women as they're being raped and assaulted by white males that make up the same look that you have in on the Donald Trump administration. Google it. Just look at some of the pictures. It looks just like it almost. We got to change that. We know the president just appointed his 200th federal judge. But I hope that it's a matter of the heart, like the Pope says. I believe that all these judges, that just like NASCAR changed, they took the Confederate flag down. Who would have ever thought that? Not many people would have ever thought that NASCAR would have an egalitarian spirit and the spirit that matches Pope Francis and many other good pastors around the world. But they did. And I'm praying that Congress and the judges will have the same type of good thoughts and change things. It takes time. Like we say, is it fair for NFL teams to ask fans to sign a waiver to attend NFL games this season, Big C? How many licks would it take to get to the center of a lollipop? How many people have to get sick before they say, you know what? Maybe we'll put a pause. We'll put a pause on this. It's so important. I love talking about equality, liberty, and justice for all, because it affects everybody. It affects me. It affects people that I love. And I want to make sure that it happens for everybody. We're still playing our sports. PGA Golf Cameron Champ is added to the Rocket Mortgage Classic in Detroit, Michigan, Big C. Detroit, Motown. He tested positive for COVID-19, but he also had some follow-up tests, and he tested negative. So he was added to the field of the Rocket Mortgage Classic in Detroit under a modified PGA Tour policy that allows players who test positive for COVID-19 to be eligible if they had no symptoms and get 2 negative test results in the last at least 24 hours apart. So he's going to be able to do his thing. That decision came down Wednesday. I just hope that people can stay healthy through the whole process, because we all want to play sports. We've had cases rising of COVID-19 in Florida. People are getting ready for this beautiful 4th of July holiday celebration. And I know there are going to be people that get together, even though the governors are saying don't get together. There's always some knuckleheads. I even heard down in Alabama, you know, sometimes children do stupid things. But I heard that some teenagers were getting together trying to have a COVID-19 party to test positive so they could win money. Whatever that is, doesn't make any sense. But even when it comes to money, college football, Texas A&M football program put on a 1-year probation due to Jimbo Fisher. I think he got the $75 million, Big C. But Texas A&M football was placed on probation for a year. Coach Jimbo Fisher was given a 6-month show for cause to order that he and the program were found to have violated the NCAA recruiting and athletic-related activity. They're part of the SEC now, Big C. They really got to do what the SEC schools are doing to keep those athletes coming in. The NCAA did not name the assistant coach, but Texas A&M later identified him as Jay Graham, who is now an assistant at another SEC school, Big C, Tennessee. It's all fair love and war. But a lot of good old boys are doing whatever it takes to keep their programs rolling high and rolling through. If they say roll tide, a lot of people are trying to roll like the tide. And sometimes you got to put your hand in the cookie jar if you want to roll like the tide. So will the NBA basketball players put an asterisk to the 2020 COVID-19 championship season? A lot of players are saying, heck no, we won't. They don't want to put an asterisk to anything. In fact, if it even happens. But 2020 NBA champion, if one is crowned, will have emerged as the ultimate winner from a season that lasted more than a year from start to finish. A season that saw political unrest, like POTUS saying Black Lives Don't Matter, like POTUS saying nothing of Vladimir Putin for putting a bounty on U.S. troops. What a shame. Do people know that? That flag that set the Confederate flag, that say, I will not watch a game if people don't take a knee, but you can put out a bounty on U.S. troops and people say nothing. The season saw a lot of political unrest, from the Pope Francis saying Black Lives Do Matter, between the NBA and China, the deaths of David Stern and Kobe Bryant, racial issues across the country and world, and if that's not enough, the pandemic. But there are people putting their heads together to try to figure out a way to form a more perfect union. I hope that we can all, as we go into this 4th of July weekend, stay safe, stay encouraged, wash your hands, Big C. How many licks does it take to get to the center of a lollipop? I might even do that experiment. You guys can join me. How many licks does it take to get to the center of a lollipop? We can all do that experiment, Big C. It's all fair, love, and war. I just love what we do with Big C Sports. Really looking forward to a great 4th of July as much as possible. I'm glad that people are reading. I love opening up our show talking about the sacrifice that black women have made in the original Me Too movement. No one pays much attention to it. I want the $100 million that Joe Rogan's getting for saying, welcome to the Mother Blanking Show, Big C. How many licks does he say it takes to get to the center of a $100 million contract? That's what I want to find out, Big C. We the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our prosperity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. How many licks does it take to get to the center of the lollipop? You see, that's my mantra for this weekend. How many licks does it take to get to the center of the lollipop? It's all fair, love, and war. Big C, back in the day, there's a man by the name of Drew Boudini Brown. He was known as Muhammad Ali's right-hand man, and he would always tell Ali, with all you got to use, how can you lose? Rumble, young man, rumble. Big C, what are you looking forward to in the sports universe? As I know you always want to tell people, keep hope alive. Make sure we take care of the people we love. If that means pick up the phone or text. Yes, Black Lives Matter. And let's make sure that everybody is in prayer for this country of ours. I like what Pope Francis says. There's no room for racism. And we all got to buy that message. It's a very good message. You can follow Big C Sports 24 hours a day, 7 days a week on the #1 podcast network in the universe, iHeartRadio podcast. You can follow Big C Sports on Apple Podcasts. You can follow Big C Sports on Google Podcasts. Anywhere in the world, just say Google or Alexa, play Big C Sports Podcast. And I really appreciate that. Big C, as we always tell you, there's never, ever an excuse for domestic violence or racism. Anybody going through that garbage, please pick up the phone and call 911, because no man or woman should ever have to go through that garbage on their own. No man, woman, or child. And as we always tell you on every Big C Sports show, we thank you, we appreciate you, and we hope that you have a super fantastic day.